Well, happy Sabbath everyone, and welcome back again to the Bible Biography channel. Now, so far in this series covering lessons from the patriarchs, we've looked at the three patriarchs who are most often grouped together. That is Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, Jacob's son Joseph is no less a character in the book of Genesis than Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, the character that he displayed in his life was quite exemplary with the help and power of God. And in terms of physical wealth and power, he would eventually become greater than all those three great patriarchs before him. Joseph's story is told to us from chapters 37 to 50 of Genesis, and we find the story of his birth a few chapters earlier in Genesis 30. Now, according to my tentative chronology, Joseph was born around 1699 BC. Now, he was born in Haran in Syria, where his father Jacob was sent at age 77 to go and find a wife amongst his own people, where Abraham originally came from. Now, not only does he find a wife, he ends up with two wives through the deception of his uncle Laban. Now, he marries both the daughters of his uncle Laban. And through those wives and their handmaids, he would end up fathering 12 sons. Now, after Jacob had served two lots of 7 years, or 14 years in total, for his wives, Joseph was born. Now, Jacob then worked another 6 years for Laban's flocks before moving back to Canaan around when Joseph was about 6 years old. Now, Joseph was sold into slavery when he was 17 years old. Now, after a series of extraordinary events, he would eventually be elevated to the position of vizier over Egypt at 30 years old, around 1669 BC. Now, 9 years later, following the 7 years of plenty and into the second year of the 7-year famine, more extraordinary events would occur that would lead to the reunion of Joseph and his father and brothers, and his father and entire family would move to Egypt around 1660 BC. Now, Galatians 3 tells us that there were 430 years between when Abraham received the promise of becoming a great nation at the time he moved to Canaan, and when the law was given at Mount Sinai. Now, Jacob moved to Egypt exactly halfway into that 430-year period between Abraham and the Exodus. Now, Joseph lived another 71 years after his father Jacob moved to Egypt, and Jacob would later die around 1589 BC. Now, that year was about 64 years before Moses was born, and about 144 years before the Exodus. Now, Joseph's mother, Rachel, was initially barren, but God intervened and healed Rachel of her barren womb. Now, when Joseph is born, she says that God has at last taken away her reproach, the stigma of being barren. Now, her name for him, Joseph, expresses ongoing faith that God will bless her in the future with another son. Now, she calls him Joseph, which means he shall add. And she says that the Lord shall add to me another son. Now, it will take around another 12 to 15 years, but she'll have one more son. Now, Jacob then left Haran another 6 years after Joseph and his half-sister Dinah are born. Now, Dinah has probably just become a teenager when that debacle at Shechem occurred, and is soon after that when Jacob is on his way to see his father in Hebron that Benjamin is born. Now, Joseph will lose his mother probably at around about age 15 as she dies in childbirth while giving birth to Benjamin. Now, Joseph would have a special connection with Benjamin over the other brothers, as Benjamin was the only other brother born to the same mother as him. Now, we know that Joseph was sold in slavery at age 17, so this means that Benjamin was probably only about 2 or 3 years old at the time that Joseph was sold into slavery. Now, Jacob had 12 sons who would become the fathers of the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, 6 of those came through Leah, the older of his 2 wives. 2 each came through Leah and Rachel's handmaids. And the last 2 born sons, Joseph and Benjamin, came through Jacob's favourite wife, Rachel. Now, generally, the right to be the next ruling patriarch over the household and the double portion of the inheritance would go to the oldest son. Now, this did not happen when Jacob passed these on to his sons. Now, due to the sins of the 3 oldest sons, the promise of rulership over the household went to the 4th born son, Judah. Now, Judah was the father of the Jews. Now, David and the line of kings which came from him were all from the tribe of Judah. Now, the double portion of the inheritance usually went to whoever would be the next ruling patriarch. However, that did not happen with the inheritance of Jacob, surprisingly. Jacob did not give the double portion of the inheritance to Judah. He would give it instead to the firstborn son of his second and favourite wife, Rachel. Now, that son, of course, was Joseph. Now, this is highly significant as the double portion of the inheritance was not merely limited to the physical estate of Jacob at the time, but included promises from God of great national wealth to Joseph's descendants. Now, the story of Joseph, apart from his birth, begins in Genesis 37. Now, Joseph was 17 at the time, and in verse 3 it states that Israel, or Jacob, loved Joseph more than all his children. Now, it states that he made him a tunic of many colours. Now, following Reuben's adultery with Jacob's concubine and the previous actions of Simeon and Levi, it is likely at this stage that Jacob intended to pass the birthright and possibly even the blessing of patriarchal rule over the whole clan after he died to the firstborn of his favourite wife, which was Joseph. Now, when people are given a title, they are often given special garments, and the act of giving these garments and title is referred to as an investiture or being invested. You might think of, say, Prince Charles when he was invested with the title of Prince of Wales. Now, the coat Joseph might possibly have been given, it may have been given possibly as a symbol that Jacob had intended to pass on to him the birthright instead of giving it to Judah or the other brothers. Now, the Hebrew word translated colours in the New King James Version is the word pas, P-A-S. Now, Strong's in defining this word says that by implication, a long and sleeved tunic, which is actually translated as in certain other translations. Now, the implication of a long-sleeved tunic was that he didn't need to work while he was wearing it. Now, the Life Application Bible notes in its commentary about this verse, most robes were knee-length, short-sleeved, and plain. In contrast, Joseph's robe was probably of the kind worn by royalty, long-sleeved, ankle-length, and colourful. The robe became a symbol of Jacob's favouritism toward Joseph, and it aggravated the already strained relations between Joseph and his brothers in the home. Now, this special treatment that Jacob gives to Joseph over his brothers went over like a lead balloon with his brothers, who begin to hate and envy him even more. Now, in part 2, we'll look at evidence that leads towards the possibility that a palace and statue found at Tel El Daba in the Nile Delta may actually be that of Joseph. Now, the traces of colour that they found on the statue there indicates the colours of the multi-striped coat of the dignitary whose statue that was red, blue and gold. Now, these 3 colours, red, blue and gold, just happen to also be the same colours of today's British royal throne. Now, Joseph's dreams of the brothers and his parents bowing down and paying homage to him further added fuel to the fire of the brothers' hatred of Joseph. Now, these would have been really vivid dreams that were much more vivid than our usual dreams, and Joseph would have felt that it may have come from God, so he shares them with his whole family. Now, the brothers pick up on the obvious meaning of these dreams, that he is claiming that he'll one day rule over them, as does his father, who rebukes him, saying, "Shall your mother and I and your brothers indeed come to bow to the earth before you?" Now notice it's not just his mother and brothers who bow before him, but his father as well. Now, even if Joseph is appointed the next ruler of the clan, this would not take effect until Jacob died. So this authority over them is not authority within the clan, but a much wider authority being spoken of here. Now, though rebuking Jacob, it says that he kept the matter in mind. Now, we've already seen that Jacob's mother, Rachel, had died at this point in time. So who is the mother that is spoken of here? Now, quite likely this is a reference to Leah, who now takes over the role as mother to Joseph and Benjamin after Rachel's death. Now, Joseph at this time should have sensed the envy and hatred from his brothers, but he unwisely shares this dream with the whole family rather than with just his parents. Now, he seems rather oblivious to his brothers' feelings and how the message of this dream will just inflame their envy and hatred of him even more. So why does he tell the dreams to his brothers and not just his father, when he should know that it will only anger his brothers? Well, perhaps we see some youthful pride here on Joseph's part. Or perhaps Joseph is just simply naive and not recognising the angst that his brothers have against him. Now, this brings us to our first lesson that we can learn from Joseph. Be aware of when others have an issue with you and do your part to reconcile with them. Now, if Joseph was situationally aware, he probably would have picked up his father's favouritism as being unfair onto his brothers, and perhaps told his brothers that he would talk to his father about it in order to help diffuse their hostility toward them. Now, Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5:23-24 says, "Therefore, if you bring your gift to the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go your way. First be reconciled to your brother, and then come and offer your gift." Now, we should be aware when others have an issue with our behaviour or with us in general, and we should strive to be reconciled wherever possible. Now, Paul in Romans 12:18 says, "If it is possible, as much as depends on you, live peaceably with all men." Now, sometimes the other party might do their part, and we can't be reconciled, but we should at least do what we can to be at peace with others. Now, the ironic thing about the dreams is that the dreams are not just prophecies, but they also serve as catalysts that sets in motion events that will eventually culminate with the exodus from Egypt. Now, Joseph's dreams, due to the reaction that they will provoke in Joseph's brothers, will set in motion events that will enable the family of Israel to survive a future famine and provide the means for bringing Israel and his sons to Egypt, where the descendants will eventually become a large nation and ultimately be delivered in great miraculous power. Now, at this point in the story of Joseph, Jacob has been spending much of his time in Hebron, where his elderly and blind father Isaac is. But he still has flocks up in Shechem, where he sends a number of his sons to tend. Now, Jacob wants to know how the sons are going up in Shechem, and so he sends Joseph up to Shechem to bring back word. Now, previously, Joseph has given a bad report of the sons of Jacob's concubines. Now, the sons have gone further north from Shechem up to the town of Dothan. Now you can see here a picture of Tel Dothan overlooking the valley of Dothan. Now the other biblical claim to fame of this particular location in Israel is that this is where Elisha was when he and his servants were given that vision of angels on chariots of fire. Now the sons then conspire to kill him. Now Reuben was okay with the part about casting him into a pit or well, hoping to go back and to rescue him later. Now Reuben probably feels a lot of guilt for the hurt that he's caused his father with his sexual relationship with Bilhah, and doesn't want to add to that. Now the brothers then cast him into a pit, and as the brothers were eating, Judah, after seeing a caravan of traders heading to Egypt, pipes up and says, "Why kill him? Let's make a bit of money and sell him as a slave to the traders." So they do a deal and they sell him for 20 shekels. Now in Leviticus 27:5, in the laws concerning vows, Moses estimates a male from ages 5 to 20, which Joseph was, at that same price of 20 shekels. A manservant was valued by Moses at 30 shekels, later in Exodus 21. Now by the 8th century BC, the price of slaves, as noted in Assyrian records, had risen to about 50 or 60 shekels, and further to 90 to 120 shekels during the Persian Empire. Now if the story of Joseph had been dreamed up by Jewish scribes after the Jews were taken to Babylon in the 6th century BC, as some skeptics have suggested, why isn't the price in Genesis for Joseph around 90 shekels? Now this argues that the story of Joseph is a real story and not just a fictional one. Now notice in one verse the traders are referred to as Midianite, and in another they are referred to as Ishmaelites. So we see that there was a mixture of both Midian and Ishmaelites in this particular caravan. Now we see a similar mix of these two peoples in the book of Gideon in the book of Judges. And the Midianites were also mixed in considerably with the Moabites, as seen in the story of the women that Balak sent into the camp of Israel to seduce the males before the Israelites crossed over to the Jordan. Now Reuben, for some reason, was away from the brothers at the time of the transaction with the traders. Now he then goes back to the pit to rescue Joseph, only to find out that they'd sold him into slavery. Now rather than turning him in, sadly Reuben goes along with their deception to make out as if Joseph had been killed by a wild animal, which absolutely devastates his father Jacob when he is told. And we see that Joseph, upon his arrival to Egypt, is sold to Potiphar, an officer of the Pharaoh and a captain of the guard. Now inserted in between the story of Joseph being sold into slavery and Joseph's rise to power in Egypt is the strange story of Judah and his line of descendants in Genesis 38. Now hopefully the chart which is on your handout will help clarify some of these complicated details. Now Judah goes off from Jacob's household to people that he knows in the Judean foothills southwest of Jerusalem. Now the impression that's given is that he's left the clan without Jacob's permission, though we later see him return to Jacob's clan at the time of the famine. Now he marries a Canaanite woman called Shua and has 3 sons through her. Now the first 2 sons enter their teenage years. Now is given a wife named Tamar. Now we don't know the specifics of what he does, but is wicked enough for God to strike him dead. Now one strange law that had a lot to do with the inheritance of goods in this culture was a law called the Levirate law. Now if a woman became a widow without a son, the brother of the dead husband was to marry the widow and bear that widow a son. Now Onan shared this responsibility, and he was also struck dead by God, leaving just the one last brother who was too young at the time to take up that responsibility. Now, when he grew up a few more years later, Judah failed to marry him off to Tamar. Now, aching for children, she pulls off this deception on her her father-in-law, Judah. Now, Tamar pretended to be a prostitute, and Judah sought to have sex with her, not realising who she was. Now, as a pledge of payment, she took some items which he then later produced when she was accused of harlotry, which exposed Judah as having slept with her. Now, not only that, she ended up having twin sons from this act of prostitution. Now, Judah confessed to his sin, but never had sex with her again. But Judah would then go on to have 4 other sons. Now, what is not clear is whether Judah's wife, the daughter of Shua, was the mother of those 4, or whether she had died before or after the affair with Tamar. So there may have been another wife. Now, Judah stated that she has been more righteous than I. Now, although Tamar did dress as a prostitute, it was Judah who solicited her. Tamar was ensuring that an heir would be raised up to her husband, a responsibility that Judah willfully abandoned. Now, we don't know for sure what Tamar's ethnicity was, but it's probably a little more likely that she was a Canaanite and not a woman from amongst Jacob's servants who were of the same ethnicity as Jacob and his clan, though the latter is still a possibility. Now, it would later be through Tamar and her son Perez that the line of Jewish kings would be born from. Now, after and Onan died, Shelah became the oldest son, yet God worked things out so that the scepter promise of rulership over the other tribes of Israel did not pass through the line of Shelah, who did have children, but through the descendants of that sordid affair between Judah and Tamar. It would be through the oldest son of Tamar that both David, the kings of Judah, and ultimately Jesus Christ would descend from. Now, this seems very complicated, but the point is that this choice shows the humility of God to be willing to have his son born through a line that had such a scandalous affair. Now, Tamar would give birth to twin boys. Now, a scarlet thread to indicate the one that came out first was put on Zerah, but then Perez, or Phares as he's also called, came out first. Now, his name means breach. Now, it's interesting that his alternate name, Phares, is very close to Pharisee, as in the Pharisees of the New Testament, which is the same root meaning to separate. Now, it was Phares or Perez who became the firstborn, and from him came the royal line of David, the kings of Judah, and Jesus Christ. Now, Zerah wasn't quite so honoured, but was this breach where Perez or Phares sneakily got that honour ever healed? Well, there are scholars who claim that the kings of Ireland are descended from Zerah, and that in the time of Jeremiah, after Zedekiah's sons were all killed by Nebuchadnezzar, that Jeremiah took one of the king's daughters of the line of Phares or Perez to Ireland to marry a local Irish priest, which helped to keep the throne of David alive. Now, such a union would have brought the two lines of Phares and Zerah together at the royal level. Now, we know that part of this line of Irish kings eventually led to the line of Scottish and English kings that ultimately led to today's current British royal throne. Now, when Jacob moved to Egypt, we know that Joseph was around about 39 years old. So how old was Judah at the same time? Well, we know that Jacob married Leah 14 years before Joseph was born. So if Judah, who was the fourth born, he was probably born about 11 years before Joseph, meaning he would have been about 50 years old at the time that they all moved to Egypt. Now Genesis 46:12 indicates that Judah's grandson Perez through Tamar was already a father when Jacob's whole household moved to Egypt. Now remember, Perez's mother, Tamar, originally married Judah's firstborn son so she is now a grandmother and probably no older than about 35 years old. Now we next pick up the story of Joseph in Genesis 39, where we read the following. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, brought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he was a successful man, and he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all he did to prosper in his hand. So Joseph found favour in his sight and served him. Then he made him overseer of his house and all that he had put under his authority. So it was from the time that he had made him overseer of his house and all he had that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in the house and in the field. Thus he left all that he had in Joseph's hand, and he did not know what he had except for the bread which he ate. So we see here that the man who ends up buying Joseph is Potiphar, an officer and captain of the guard, a high official in Pharaoh's court. We see that God blessed whatever Joseph did. Now no doubt Joseph worked diligently, and God saw that and blessed the results of whatever he put his hand to. Now, as part of the wages for their job, certain Egyptian court officials were given land from the Pharaoh to derive an income from. And the more that the land produced, the more wealth that this official gained. And it is likely that Joseph started off working in the fields. Now, Joseph may have learnt a few agricultural tricks from amongst the servants who worked with his father before he went into slavery, and perhaps he offered to try out some of those in Potiphar's field, and God greatly blessed that part of the harvest. Now before Joseph's slavery, his father Jacob would have ensured that Joseph was well educated. Now that may have included learning how to read and write, and basic business principles to assist in the family business. Now the discovery of such skills may have also prompted Potiphar to have him serve inside his house. Now given the positive relationship that he's developed with Potiphar, you wonder if Joseph ever tried to get a message to his father that he's still alive and in Egypt. Now Joseph must have demonstrated great trustworthiness in all his tasks for Potiphar to trust him as overseer of his house. And God continued to bless Potiphar for Joseph's sake. Now remember, Joseph has been unfairly sold off as a slave, but he didn't sulk and play the victim. Amazingly, Joseph didn't grumble about the terrible turn of events which had separated him from his family, but he applied himself diligently as he could to his duties, having faith that God would turn things around for him when the time was right. Now this brings us to the second lesson that we can learn from Joseph's life. Have a positive, strong work ethic even in the worst of working situations like Joseph. Now we might complain about our work environment, but at least we are free, unlike Joseph. Now Joseph gave his all in good service, and God blessed him as he put his heart into serving his master. Now, two people can go through the same trials of life, yet one can be much more positive and joyful than the other based on their attitude and reaction to those difficulties of life. Now, Joseph kept close to God and strived to be a good ambassador of God's way, even in the worst of circumstances. Now, maybe it was Joseph's example that inspired Solomon to write in Proverbs 22:29. Do you see a man who excels in his work? He will stand before kings. He will not stand before unknown men. Now, if we show ourselves trustworthy in the way that we do our duties, those over us will be more inclined to trust us with more. Now Joseph has probably been with Potiphar for close to 10 years at this stage, that he has made overseer over Potiphar's household. Now just when things are going well for Joseph, things then take a sudden turn for the worst with what happens next. Now starting in verse 6 of Genesis 39 we read, "Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance, and it came to pass after these things that his master's wife cast longing eyes on Joseph, and she said, 'Lie with me.' But he refused and said to his master's wife, 'Look, my master does not know what is with me in the house, and he's committed all that he has to my hand. There is no one greater in this house than I, nor has he kept back anything from me but you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?'" Now Joseph is a good-looking guy, and Potiphar's wife, not caring about any loyalty to her husband, begins to lust for him sexually and then straight up asks him to have sex with her. Now Joseph, probably out of loyalty to his master, as well as fear of him if he weakened to such a temptation and was found out, resists the temptation. Now he probably hopes that she is reminded of her need for loyalty to her, as he speaks of it not being his place to do any such thing with her. Now Joseph doesn't treat this sin as a small thing, but as a great wickedness. And when we are tempted, we have to be careful that we don't treat those sins as light matters. Now Joseph labels the act of adultery she is proposing as a sin against God, not just an act between two consenting adults, and not just cheating on her husband. Now in Romans 5 verse 13, the Apostle Paul said, "Sin is not imputed when there is no law." So, if adultery was a sin, then obviously God had a law against adultery at this time, long before the Ten Commandments were given to Moses. Now in Genesis 26:5 we also read how God says about Abraham, "Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws." Now it's a biblical myth to say that the laws and statutes of God didn't exist until God gave them at Mount Sinai. Now additional statutes and laws may have been given at Mount Sinai, but the Ten Commandments and many other laws existed long before the laws and statutes were codified at Mount Sinai. Now Potiphar's wife doesn't respond to the hint that he gives to her, and she continues to hit on Joseph. So it was, as she spoke to Joseph day by day, that he did not heed her to lie with her or to be with her. But it happened about this time when Joseph went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the house were inside, that she caught him by his garment and said, "Lie with me." But he left his garment in her hand and fled and ran outside. And so it was when he saw that he had left his garment in her hand and fled outside, that she called to the men of the house and spoke to them, saying, "See, he has brought into us a Hebrew to mock us. He came in to lie with me," and I cried out with a loud voice. I don't know. Now, though it would cost him dearly in the short term, Joseph stayed loyal to God and his laws and steadfastly resisted the sexual temptations of Potiphar's wife. And it got to the point where he literally had to flee from her to avoid her advances. Now this brings us to lesson 3 that we can learn from the life of Joseph. Flee sexual immorality like Joseph did when tempted by Potiphar's wife. Now James 4:7 says, "Resist the devil and he will flee from you." Now that works well for almost all temptations except one, sexual temptation. And we read in Proverbs 5:8 what we should do regarding the adulterous woman. "Keep your path far from her and do not go near the door of her house." And of course, Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 6:18 to flee sexual immorality. Or, to put it in modern terminology, Run, Forrest, run! I love that picture. Now, following his comments about not lusting after a woman, Jesus went on to say in the Sermon on the Mount, if your right eye causes you to sin, pluck it out and cast it from you. For it is more profitable for you that one of your members perish than for your whole body to be cast into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and cast it from you. For it is more profitable for you that one of your members perish than for your whole body to be cast into hell. Now, obviously, Jesus meant this as a figure of speech and not to be taken literally. Otherwise, we'd have a few guys missing hands and looking like Cyclops. Now, the hand and the eye only follow what the mind wants to do, which tells the hand and eye what to do. The problem is with what goes on inside of our minds, as was covered in the sermon. Now, Jesus here is telling us with some sense that we need to take drastic action to help keep our hearts and minds pure. Now, with the internet and smartphones and other media and technology, there are more sexual temptations and easy access to sexual material way beyond any other time in man's history. And we need to be diligent to protect ourselves through whatever we might be vulnerable to. Now, I'm very cautious about such temptations in my life. Now, with my laptops, I've found software filters to be too ineffective to do what I want them to do. So at the suggestion of the PC era, I've implemented a radical hardware solution. I ended up pulling out the wireless cards from my laptops and snapped the wires of the Ethernet ports. So the only way that my laptops can connect up to the internet is with a wireless USB dongle that I've got stored at a different location in my place. So I end up doing most of my internet stuff at local libraries. I also have browsers and certain other apps blocked or password protected with someone else having a password on my iPhone and my smart TV. Now, this is a radical step that I've taken, and it can be inconvenient at times, but at least there's peace of mind knowing that I don't have to deal with that level of access. Now, I remember watching a sermon by a pastor who discussed some similar things that he has implemented to protect himself spiritually. Now, people might ask, am I really that weak? And he said, most of the time, no. But why in the world would I resist a temptation in the future that I have the power to eliminate today? Now, continuing on with Joseph's story, we read in Genesis 39, starting from verse 19. So it was when his master heard the words which his wife spoke to him, saying, your servant did to me after this manner, that his anger was aroused. Then Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, a place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in the prison. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy, and he gave him favour in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners who were in the prison, whatever they did there. It was his doing. The keeper of the prison did not look into anything that was under Joseph's authority, because the Lord was with him. And whatever he did, the Lord made it to prosper. So unfortunately for Joseph, Potiphar's wife has him framed by lying and saying that he tried to rape her. But God would again turn the situation into good for Joseph. Now we get the impression from his anger being aroused that Potiphar believed his wife over believing Joseph. However, the punishment is perhaps a mild one if we look at it. Such an offence could have potentially resulted in his death, yet he is only imprisoned. Now, it would have hurt Potiphar to have lost such a valuable servant as Joseph. Now, he may or may not have suspected his wife was lying, though he would have felt that he could not have sided with her against Joseph if it was her word against his. Now, some of you may have seen the excellent Time Life Bible movie on Joseph. Now, Joseph was played in that movie by Aussie actor Paul Mercurio who starred in the movie Strictly Ballroom. And Potiphar was played by legendary actor Ben Kingsley. Now, in the movie, Potiphar does suspect his wife and believes that Joseph is telling the truth, but without any additional evidence, he is forced to side with her and banish poor old Joseph. Now we get the sense that the prisoners had tasks that were given to them in prison, and like he did with Potiphar, he did whatever he was assigned to in such a trustworthy and positive way that God granted him favour in the warden's sight that Joseph ended up managing the other prisoners. Now continuing on in chapter 40 we read, "And it came to pass after these things that the butcher and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their lord, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was angry with the two officers, the chief butler and the chief baker. So he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard in the prison, the place where Joseph was confined. Then the butler and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, had a dream, both of them. Each man's dream of one night, and each man's dream with its own interpretation. So he asked Pharaoh's officers who were with him in the custody of his lord's house, saying, 'Why do you look sad today?' And they said to him, 'We each have had a dream, and there is no interpreter of it.' So Joseph said to them, 'Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell them to me, please.' Then the chief butler told him his dream to Joseph and said to him, 'Behold, in my dream was a vine before me, and in the vine were 3 branches. It was as though it budded and its blossoms shot forth, and its clusters brought forth ripe grapes. Then Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup and placed the cup into Pharaoh's hand.' And Joseph said to him, 'This is the interpretation of it. The 3 branches are 3 days. Now within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your place, and you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand according to the former manner when you are his butler. But remember me when it is well with you, and please show kindness to me. Make mention of me to Pharaoh, and get me out of this house. For indeed I was stolen away from the land of the Hebrews, and also I have done nothing here that they should put me into this dungeon.' Now when the baker saw that the interpretation was good, he said to Joseph, 'I also was in my dream, and there were 3 white baskets on my head. In the uppermost basket were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh, and the birds ate them out of the basket on my head.' So Joseph answered and said, 'This is the interpretation of it. 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head from you and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat the flesh from you.' Now it came to pass on the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, that he made a feast for all his servants, and he lifted up the head of the chief butler and of the chief baker among his servants. Then he restored the chief butler to his butlership again, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker, as Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet the chief butler did not remember Joseph, but forgot him." So we see here God begins to intervene in Joseph's situation by giving prophetic dreams to these 2 servants of Pharaoh that had been recently imprisoned after offending the Pharaoh. Now Joseph shows concern for them and asks why do they look sad following their dreams. And it seems that straight after they tell him their dreams that he's got an answer from God to tell them. Now we're not told exactly how God conveyed the interpretations to Joseph. Or maybe he silently prayed to God and then audibly in his mind got an answer from God. Now Joseph may have had hope that God was finally beginning to act to get him out of prison after the butler was restored, as Joseph had predicted. But to his disappointment, he would linger in prison for another 2 years. Now there's one point that I'd like to draw out as part of the story. Now in Genesis 40 verse 8, when Joseph is encouraging the prisoners to share their dreams with him, he says, "Do not interpretations belong to God?" Now when he later interprets Pharaoh's dream, notice what he says to Pharaoh. So Joseph answered Pharaoh saying, "It is not in me. God will give Pharaoh an answer of peace. And Pharaoh said to and Joseph said to Pharaoh, the dreams of Pharaoh are one and the same. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. Now notice here in both cases, Elohim or God is given the credit about these interpretations from Joseph. Joseph never takes the credit for these interpretations, but gives that credit to God. Now this brings us to the fourth lesson that we can learn from Joseph's life. Give the credit to God for the opportunities, knowledge and help that he gives to you to succeed in life like Joseph did. So that brings us to the end of part one of lessons from Joseph. Now next time, in part two, we will look at the stunning rise to power of Joseph from prisoner to vizier over Egypt, which leads to a remarkable reunion with the rest of his family and their eventual move to Egypt. Now, in addition to three other key lessons that we can learn from his life, I'll also cover some of the remarkable archaeological evidence of the Israelites in Egypt and what is very likely to be evidence of Joseph himself. So thanks for your attention. I look forward to covering the rest of the story of Joseph with you when I'm back up here next time, which I believe will be